Okay, thank you everyone. So what I'm going to be talking about is something called hierarchical card sorting, which is a simple tool for qualitative inquiry, which also happens to be useful for planning and evaluation purposes. And I've got to get your screen out of the way, that's better. So there are many different ways of doing card sorting or pile sorting investigations. These have been developed over a long period of time by a range of people, mainly anthropologists and ethnographers, but more recently by people designing websites and trying to make websites navigatable to enable people to find what they want on a website as quickly as possible. So card sorting is used primarily by many of these people to elicit people's mental models. In other words, the categories they use to describe things, what belongs to those categories, and how the categories relate to each other. This particular method of card sorting I developed as part of my PhD research on organizational learning in Bangladesh in the 1990s, and I used it a lot in the 1990s, which was in some respects a heyday for participatory research and monitoring and evaluation methods, although it's still widely used. And hierarchical card sorting is what I would call a sibling of most significant change method, which some of you might have heard about. Central to the question of a hierarchical card sorting inquiry is a question, central to the method of a hierarchical card sorting inquiry is a question about the most significant difference, a static difference, the most significant difference between things, whereas most significant change asks about the most significant change. So one is about static differences and the other one is changes over time. And both methods ask respondents to make observations about what the difference is and then interpretations of the significance of that change or difference. So what I'm going to be explaining now is the process of doing hierarchical card sorting, and I'm going to focus initially on the central part of it, which is listing and then sorting, and then I'm going to be talking about the additional things you can do, which I've put under the title of exploring and testing. So I probably won't say any more about that, and I'll just proceed straight into the description. So how does sorting works? So if you're an ethnographer, someone trying to just uncover how people think about things, which is always a useful thing if you're trying to be of assistance to people and institutions, what you'll start off firstly is trying to identify the respondent's area of expertise that you want to explore. We will probably take that for granted in the examples we're going to show. But then the next step, we will generate a list of actual cases that will be sorted by the participants. And these cases might be events, they might be people, they might be places, activities, or objects. And we're going to write those cases one on a card each. So we'll have a number of cards. Typically, the number of cards that you might use might be anywhere up to about 25. Beyond that, it becomes a bit cumbersome and time consuming, and you've got the risk of tiring out the respondent, getting them to lose interest. So you want to avoid that. So you start off by placing all these cards. For example, we might be talking about a number of different NGOs in Bangladesh, and I'll show you an example shortly, that a donor is thinking about funding or has been funding. So we've got all these cards and we'll put them in a pile and we'll ask the respondent, we'll start off with a warming up stage, asking them to just pulling out one card at a time and saying, how is this NGO different from all the others in the pile here? And you get them to pull out differences, like this is an older NGO, or this one's run by a woman chief executive versus men. This one here works in a very obscure niche of education, whereas the others don't. So you're trying to elicit the idea there are a lot of differences between all these entities in this pile. And then the key question is at the next stage, where you ask the respondent to sort all the cards into two piles of any size, according to what they think is the most significant difference between all the cases represented on the cards. And when people might then say, well, what do you mean by significant? We mean significant from your perspective and significant in the sense that it has some sort of consequence or implication. It makes some sort of difference. That's the key part of the process. once they've done the sorting and you allow them time to do this and you emphasize that it's not an exam, they've got as much time as they want to do this, you then make sure that you record which cards are placed in which pile, and you describe, also document the difference they've given you, the difference that they've described between the two piles, and also you document what difference that difference makes. What is the consequence or implications of that difference? I'm going to give you some concrete examples of this very shortly. Once you've done that, you then take one of the two piles and repeat exactly that steps 4 and 5 again. You get them to do a sort of that pile into two smaller piles of any size, and then you document it. Then you go to the other pile, which they originally created, get them to sort that into two smaller piles of any size, and you document that. And you keep repeating that process of splitting piles into smaller 2 piles, and then those into smaller piles of 2 piles. And you only stop when either there's only one card left in a pile, which of course you can't split, or when the respondent simply says, well, yeah, there are half a dozen NGOs in this group here, but I can't see any real significant difference between them. And at that stage, you stop. You don't push them into trying to identify something which they genuinely can't see. And then once you've done this, you try and document the exercise results in the form of a tree structure, which I'm about to show you. So this example here, this is the result of an interview with a community organizer in the Gambia in the 1990s. And I was asking him about, I think it's about 14 different villages that he was working with in the Gambia. And I was asking him to tell me about what he thought was the most significant differences between these villages in terms of their poverty. So I put a tag on the end of that question, in terms of their poverty. I could have put another sort of tag. It might have been in terms of their interest in education or something like that. It just puts a boundary on the universe that is relevant to your particular interest at the time. So you'll see that we start off on the left-hand side with all 16 villages, and it was a he, if I recall, splits them into 2 groups. One group of villages with bad housing and the other one with better housing. And I asked him to tell me more about that. And he said, well, the bad housing ones, they've got thatch roofs, whereas the ones with the good housing have got iron roofs. And then I asked the question, well, what difference does it make whether they've got thatch roof or iron roofs? And that sort of question, that's what I call a naive question, a dumb question. It's really important that you ask that naive question. And so his answer with the bad housing was that thatch roofs have 2 problems. One, they are home to mosquitoes, and secondly, there's a real fire risk with them. Whereas with an iron roof, you don't have either of those problems. So you'll notice then with each of those 2 piles, I then went and asked him to split them into 2 subsidiary groups. So with the bad housing villages, of which there were about half of them altogether, I think, I asked him to split those into 2 piles. And he said, well, these villages here, they're close to the river, and these ones over here are further away from the river. And I then said, I then asked him, well, what difference does that make? Again, asking a naive question. So he said those close to the river, they can have 2 crops a year, whereas the ones further away from the river, because of difficulty of getting access to water, they will only have 1 crop a year. And so you can see that I've continued to ask, get him to split the piles into two piles, and kept on going with that process. And in each case, with the non-bolded text, you can see the consequences that he elaborated for those. So that's one example, and I'm mindful that time is moving on. So I'm going to give you just some brief other examples. I won't go into as much detail with these other ones. So this next one is, this is a group of NGOs in Nigeria, and this bilateral aid program was thinking of working through local NGOs, and they did in a small group rather than with a single respondent. They got people to do a card sorting exercise, identifying the most significant difference between all these local NGOs. And so you can see the big difference on the left-hand side is These NGOs here are involved in direct interventions into the communities, whereas the other ones are involved in more indirect interventions. And then in the brackets after that, I've got, well, what are the implications? And the implication of being involved in more direct interventions is having greater possibility of effect on the community's lives, whereas it's less so the case with the indirect interventions. And you can see how the tree structure runs from right to left, from large groupings to smaller and smaller groupings, with the names of the NGO on the right. I'm just mindful of time, moving on. So here's a third example. This is one from Bangladesh, interviewing someone from Oxfam, Australia, about the NGOs they were supporting and the differences between those NGOs. And in this example here, I've got the differences, but I haven't got the implications of those differences. You'll notice some color coding green here, which I'll come back to shortly. So some common difficulties that you can have with this process. With any form of participatory and qualitative inquiry, the results can be context and time sensitive. You can't assume that this respondent is always going to have these views, or that all people will share those views. Secondly, people might say, well, there's no difference between all these. And in that case, it's a sensitive process of inquiry there, because they may generally not see any difference, or they may just need some encouragement to think about the cases that they're looking there. The other opposite is that people just may toss off lots of differences without thinking about the implications. They've just been taking the approach too casually. And there you need to say, well, what is the significance of that difference? Other people can have another problem. They can just throw out, have multiple differences and not make a choice between them. And you've got to sensitively ask them to try and focus on the one they think is most significant. And the last one, which I've touched upon, which is the problem, you've got to be careful that you don't assume you know what the significance is of the difference, or that the respondent doesn't simply assume that you know. You've got to ask those naive questions. So let's see whether we can go any further in the time we've got. So the uses of hierarchical card sorting, I'm going to separate them out from an ethnographic point of view, and then from a sort of more project management and monitoring and evaluation point of view. So from an ethnographic point of view, sorry, I'm just having trouble with them getting various things out of the way. What you can do with this method is identify the distinctions that people see are important in the world. And you can also identify the limits of people's knowledge, where they don't really know much about things, which is sometimes very useful. And also you can identify what you might call the direction of learning, that they've got a lot of very fine distinction in this area, because they've been interested in that area, and that's where they've accumulated more knowledge. Now, once you've got that tree structure, you've got the possibility of moving into the next stage, which is to start asking binary choice questions, starting from the top of the tree, and asking the person, for example, if they were a community organizer, like the example I gave, how will your work in the next 6 months with this group, this pile here, be different from this pile over here? Or which of these two groups do you plan to be spending more time with? Or which of these two groups of NGOs do you want to expand funding to versus reduce funding or keeping it the same? Or which of these two groups do you think will be more successful in terms of X, Y, and Z over the next period of time versus less successful? So you can you can ask that same question all the way down the tree structure, and get so for example, with that, if I can go back a step here, I was asking them about which ones they wanted to fund more versus less. And so out of that, you'll see on the right-hand side, by asking all those binary questions, I ended up with a ranking with the NGOs at the top at the top of the diagram being the ones that they most want to fund in the future. And we've got quite a sophisticated description here of the characteristics of the types of NGOs they wanted to follow and fund more in the future. So, and then moving on very quickly, we've got also the possibility of testing the relationships between those choices that we've just seen there. And if you go to the website, which has been advertised already, you'll see an example where the results of choices made through the process I've just described are then compared to some independent data on actual outcomes, and you're able to actually see whether the model, which is built into the tree structure, has been a good predictor of the outcomes that they're interested in. It's going to take me too much time to describe that at the moment, I think. I'll just summarize quickly for reflections here. So I think there's 2 or 3 things that I can sort of generalize about at the end. One is that what you might call theory in people's heads, as distinct from documented theories of change, are important, because they're the things that carry around. That's what goes around in people's heads every day. People have that in mind when they're making day-to-day decisions. So it's probably worth our paying a lot of attention to that. Secondly, the process of binary comparisons makes the assessment of what are otherwise complex cases more manageable than if we're having to look at half a dozen different cases at the same time. And thirdly, through making multiple binary comparisons in the way that I've described, you can end up with a very useful rank ordering measure of the cases that you're looking at. And there is a way of also using this to analyze MSC stories, but that's too demanding for the time at the moment. And I'm just going to end up with this link here about where you can find a web page which describes in great detail all the things I've just discussed.